Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming this morning to the Research Bureau's forum on OPEB, other post-employment benefits, how cities can keep commitments to public employees without declaring bankruptcy. My name is Roberta Schaefer, and I'm the president of the Research Bureau, and we'd like to express our gratitude to City Manager Michael O'Brien for hosting today's event in this historic chamber. Today's program is part of the Research Bureau's Francis Harrington Forums on Municipal Government. And the Research Bureau sponsors for today's forum are Commerce Bank, Polar Beverages, and the Hanover Insurance Group. And we thank them very much. The Research Bureau also wishes to express its appreciation to the Telegram and Gazette for advertising today's event. And please be sure to visit our website at wrrb.org, where you can read all the Bureau's reports, announcements of upcoming events, and view videos of past events. I want to remind everyone here today and those who will watch this on TV or streaming that the Bureau is now accepting nominations for the 2014 Thomas S. Green Public Service Awards. All the information about the awards is on the front page of our website. We also have some nomination forms available here today at the table with the coffee. And if you know of anyone who is worthy of a nomination, please do so. The deadline is for submitting nominations is November 26th. And just a quick information piece that our final forum of 2013 will take place on Wednesday, December 4th at the DCU Center, and we're putting together a distinguished panel to discuss is transportation an economic development engine for Central Massachusetts. Stay tuned. Today's forum is a follow-up to the Research Bureau's report on OPEB that we issued last spring. That was our first attempt to educate the public about Worcester's massive $656 million unfunded liability for public employee retiree health insurance and how we might begin to address it. Worcester, of course, is by no means unique. The nationwide liability for states, cities, and towns is upwards of $1 trillion. And most of the municipal bankruptcies we hear about are related to these unfunded costs. So we have put this panel together so that we can discuss how to solve this problem, if it's solvable. Our moderator today is City Manager Michael O'Brien, who I don't think needs any introduction to this audience, but I do want to take this opportunity to congratulate him for his sound management of Worcester's finances. It's a rare city that can boast 2 bond rating upgrades in 1 year and more than $9 million in free cash at year end. His self-imposed 5-point financial plan, to which the City Council has adhered, limits borrowing, increases reserves, sets aside funds for the timely repayment of capital expenditures, and for funding pensions and OPEB. Worcester is a model for a well-managed city with honest government, a rare combination today. My congratulations to him, and here's Mike O'Brien.
Thank you, Roberta, and welcome everybody to Levi Lincoln Room here in City Hall. Roberta, thank you for the kind introduction. I think there's only one person on the planet that could make a term like OPEB sexy, and that's Roberta Schaefer. So it's great to be here. Again, OPEB, as presented, other post-employment benefits. When I came on as city manager, when that term was mentioned, everybody in the room believed I was talking about a consortium of oil-producing nations in the Middle East, and that's how far we've come. The reality of folks understanding now this is real, that it's an obligation of the city, and that we have to address it in some organized way. And then we'll be talking today about GASB 43 and 45. 7 to 10 years ago, people believed that to be a movie with Robert Redford that featured robber barons and the realities of opulence gone bad, and it was just recently redone by Leonardo DiCaprio, right? The Great Gatsby. Instead, this is accounting rules and regulations to make sure that you properly identify and address your liabilities. Those were all jokes, folks. My delivery's a little off. All right. That's right. It was general admission, so. Look, it's important that we address these liabilities. As I said, they're real and they're budget busting. And you don't have to look too far to great cities like Detroit or to Stockton, California, or to San Jose in the Silicon Valley, or in our neighbors next door, Central Falls, Rhode Island, to understand when these types of liabilities aren't addressed, you're literally filing for bankruptcy. And it's going to be a greater trend. Detroit and these great cities are really the tip of the iceberg as all of us wrestle with commitments that have been made and ultimately the economy and budget's ability to afford. As a city, we saw healthcare costs growing at double digits for decades. And last fiscal year and this fiscal year, we saw 9% increases, year-to-year increases on our overall healthcare costs, when our revenues are growing at about 3%. So anybody with a quick math can determine that we are in a situation of compression where these fixed costs are gobbling up our ability to provide the basic services. We have literally become smaller. As city government, we're the better part of 500 employees fewer since I took over, and we're still providing the core services our community expects. But we now have more retirees than active employees, which further compounds this existing problem. The trend will continue under current conditions. Mass law, so everybody understands, as a city in town in Massachusetts, someone is vested after 10 years in our healthcare system. So if you serve our community for 10 years, at 65, we own 75% of your healthcare costs as it stands right now going forward. Right now, it's both in supplemental plans and overall, if they're on our conventional plans. And that's where the costs come from. Through hard work of my administration, and I got members of my administration here, Tom Zadelis, my Chief Financial Officer, Jared Connor, my Budget Director, Kathy Johnson, my Human Resource Director, as well as my Assistant City Manager, David Moore, my wartime consigliere, the City Solicitor, as well as Jimmy TikTok Del Signori, I think I saw him here, who is about to retire in January. Great work by our administration. Our elected officials, Tony Economo is here, as well as Connie Lukes, who both made OPEB a conversation during the election, as well as were there to back us up on difficult votes as we start to look at addressing this liability. And with that, we've taken our liability from 1.2, I'll have to credit our city employees as well, and unions. We've taken our liability from 1.2 billion to 656 million through reform and through cost controls. It's still a daunting number, $656 million facing our city. Right now, if we were to pre-fund this, it would require $20 million a year for the better part of 20 years just to pre-fund it. And that would mean $20 million we'd have to literally pull out of services. So you're talking about the better part of 300 employees we'd have to continue to attrit and put that money directly toward this liability. That'd be fewer teachers, be fewer firefighters, fewer police officers, fewer municipal employees when we're already as small as we are. Another group that we work with when we look at research on this particular topic, Mass Taxpayers Association, estimated that would be an additional $60,000 per taxpayer in the city of Worcester, above and beyond your current tax bill, with 2.5% increases each and every year because of Prop 2.5 per taxpayer in order to address this liability. So if you think over 20 years, literally an additional $3,000 per tax bill in order for this to be addressed properly. We've had a two-pronged approach on this OPEB liability, reduce the cost of benefits, which we've worked with our unions and our entire team. We made difficult decisions. We adopted new rules. Section 18 required our retirees to go to Medicare. Prior to that, there were retirees that remained on our conventional plans, which drove up costs. A very difficult vote. Council took that vote and allowed this very reasonable benefit to continue, and allowing our retirees now to mandatory to go over to Medicare. We've done some innovative health care plans. We've updated our plan design. We've adjusted our contribution rates, and we started to pre-fund our liability and created an OPEB trust fund. And again, with the help of Tony and Connie and the council, we've literally amended our 5-point plan to include OPEB liability as part of that. So it's this idea of recognition of the issue and then ultimately addressing it. The proposed state reforms, which will be presented today, give us a third approach, which we look forward to as an opportunity to increase minimum service eligibility from 10 to 20 years before some of these benefits kick in, prorate the benefits based on years of service, and other changes, which we'll go over today. Our goal this year was to budget $5 million, which would be $1.5 million from the city and $3.5 from the Worcester Public Schools to put into our trust fund, with 7.5% increases annually. And we look to, in that 5-point financial plan, have 30% of our free cash put aside to actually be deposited into our OPEB trust. We have, over the course of the last 2 years, some $4.35 million in this, which you could only imagine with all the stresses and strains on our services. That $4.35 million could have been used in many other ways. As was mentioned so well by Roberta, it's been recognized by Wall Street as to our strides in our recent bond rating upgrades, which again goes to strong financial management. And those are reports that are read by developers, by investors, and by policymakers and others. So it's a measure of pride that we continue to manage our budgets well. It's a crippling threat to the future operations of the city. It's about a 6-year window before we start to see a real draw away from services as we go to pay-as-you-go on this particular problem. It's prevalent across this entire state and across this nation. And so I'm glad we're here today to talk about this. More actions can change the equation, obviously from the part of our state legislators who are fully engaged on this, our employees, which we continue our conversations, especially now because all of our contracts are up, and then healthcare providers. What's in jeopardy if we don't take any action on this? We'd have to make significant cuts in municipal services. Where literally over time we'll be using our tax dollars just to fund these liabilities. So I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel today on OPEB liabilities and actions required. Our first guest is Dean Mead. He is the manager with Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB, as we call it, GASB. He's a research manager where he oversees the planning, design, and administration of GASB's research agenda, managing external research and interfacing with the academic community. Dean also coordinates the GASB's constituent outreach and communication efforts and is staff liaison to the Government Accounting Standards Advisory Council. He's the author of GASB's User Guide Series, non-technical plain language introductions to government financial statements for non-accountants. It's a great read, hot toddy, by a fire. I urge you to buy it. It's on Amazon, including the recent published second edition and analyst guides of government financial statements. He's also a lecturer at Rutgers University Business School, teaching government accounting and auditing and government financial analysis. Prior to joining GASB, he was the assistant director of research at the Citizens Budget Commission in New York City, and an adjunct professor in the public finance program at Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at New York University, where he pursued his doctoral studies. He holds an undergraduate degree in public policy from Cornell University. Dean is a member of a number of professional organizations, including the National Federation of Municipal Analysts and the American Accounting Association and the American Society for Public Administration. He serves on the editorial boards of Public Budgeting and Finance and the Journal of Government Financial Management. Let's have a warm welcome for Dean Mead as he presents his research.
Thank you. If I had known you were going to read that, I would have kept it much shorter. All right, thank you. Let me say a couple of things real quick in the way of appreciation while you soak in this disclaimer here. I'd like to refer to that as the Mission Impossible statement that says if I do anything immensely stupid this morning that my employer will deny all knowledge of my actions or existence. So I'm representing GASB, but these are my own opinions and GASB's positions are established, yada, yada, yada. I'm really grateful to have been invited to do this because as was said, prior to being at GASB, I worked for a group called the Citizens Budget Commission, which is very much like the Worcester Regional Research Bureau, and so I have a great appreciation for the work that Roberta does, and have known Roberta for a very long time, and I hope that all of you realize what a treasure you guys have, both in Roberta and in that organization. And so, being asked to come up and speak here, I was eager to do and glad that I had the time in my schedule to do it. I also should say that I was born in Springfield. My dad went to Springfield College, and so it's always good to be back in my home Commonwealth. So I'm supposed to give you an overview about OPEB nationally and a little bit about what we've done at the GASB and how that's contributed to the national dialogue. Has anybody here ever heard of GASB? Anybody who doesn't work for the city of Worcester ever heard of GASB before this morning? Oh, get out. So this is my side, that's the bride's side, obviously. The bride's family's over here, none of you know who we are. Have any of you over here heard of the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board? This is great. I've never been in a room where more people knew who we were than the FASB. FASB is our sister organization that sets standards for not-for-profits and for publicly traded companies. We set standards for state and local governments for both accounting and financial reporting. Our standards are recognized by the accounting industry as generally accepted accounting principles, and so when Worcester and other state and local governments have their financial statements audited, they're being audited against our standards. OPEB, if you don't already know already, basically we're talking about retiree health insurance. That's the big ticket item. That's the thing that most people talk about, but it's not the only thing. OPEB is in fact everything that retirees are given as benefits other than pensions, hence other post-employment benefits. And so it also includes other types of health care, dental care, legal representation, life insurance policies. It really is a wide range of things, but generally, when you're talking about OPEB, you're talking about retiree health insurance, because that's the thing that tends to cost an awful lot of money and represents the lion's share, dollar-wise, of OPEB expenditures in the country. It's also worth pointing out that that what we define as OPEB and what we require governments to report in their financial statements is not just the purchase of health insurance for employees, but also includes what we call an implicit rate subsidy, which is where no payment is made on behalf of the retirees or to the retirees, but the retirees are allowed to purchase insurance in the same covered group as the current employees, which is a significant subsidy to them. Because, as you know, health insurance gets more expensive the older you get, and so if you as a retiree can purchase insurance with a pool of people that on average is younger than you, you're going to get a much lower premium. The way that becomes a liability for the government is that the government is paying for that by, through higher than ordinary premiums for its current employees. They'll pay more for those current employees because they're being insured in the same group that these older retirees are in. And so even though there isn't a flow of cash going to the retiree or to the insurance company in that retiree's name, the government still is in fact subsidizing the health care of those retirees, and we require governments to report that just the same as they would report cash payments they're making on behalf of retirees. So in 2004, and I don't think it's an understatement, and I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the issuance of these standards requiring governments to, for the first time, calculate the liability related to their retiree health insurance was, a kickstart for a national discussion of the cost of OPEB. We didn't start it, to be certain. In my time at the Citizens Budget Commission, and well before I started working there, people were talking about the cost of health insurance both for current and retired employees for some time, and wrestling with how to deal with it, and usually eventually throwing their hands up and saying, this is intractable, we're not going to get anywhere. And so we didn't create attention for this, but we certainly did, I think, by requiring governments to put a number on that thing that everybody knew was expensive but didn't know how expensive, really got a lot of people talking. This generally was not a popular accounting standards, not that there really are any popular accounting standards, but this was a particularly unpopular accounting standard because governments didn't want to have to put a number on this. They didn't want to have to pay an actuary to do it. I can understand that. Unions didn't want to do it because they didn't want anybody to know how valuable these benefits were. It really was only groups like the Worcester Regional Research Bureau and analysts like Steve who were saying, we really need these numbers. It's gigantic. We need to, everybody needs to know how big this is so you'll realize what a big problem it is. So we required that they calculate the number, that they report it in their notes to their financial statements rather than book it as a liability, which was essentially what we already required for pension liabilities. And then if governments weren't keeping up with what their actuary had determined they should be contributing to fund those benefits, then they would accumulate a liability on the face of the financial statements, a net OPEB obligation that essentially is the accumulated difference between what was actuarially required to fund and what the government actually did contribute in each year. So I very quickly went through a bunch of state financial reports and pulled out some numbers for the big state plans. So not all 50 states are here, but many of them are here to give you a sense of how big a deal this is. This is in millions. And there are some really scary numbers there, right? California, $64 billion. 656 million doesn't seem so bad anymore. Although, I bet you if you worked it out per capita, it might be fairly close to what California is looking at. New York, 60 billion, New Jersey, 49 billion, and they have no right being that high because they're so much smaller than California and New York, both in terms of their annual budget and the population. Illinois, 33 billion, a number they love because it looks like nothing compared to their pension unfunded liability. And here's Massachusetts, which is in the top 10, but looks fairly small by comparison. So if you do look at it per capita to give you a little bit more of a comparable basis, you see that Hawaii just shoots up there. They have a crazy liability, which in terms of total dollars doesn't look that bad. Well, it is in the top 10. It's almost $12 billion. But then if you look at the population and say, well, if every single person in Hawaii had to kick in to fund their liability, it would cost each of them $8,600. That I think sort of puts it all in perspective. By comparison, Massachusetts completely drops out of the top 10. California and New York are still in the top 10, but they look a lot less daunting. But still, if I were living in California and they told me I had to kick in, what is that, $1,700 and change? I have that. I wouldn't want to give it to the state, and I'd want to know why they hadn't been putting that money in there all along. If you look at another way to look at this instead of per capita is to compare the size of the liability to the total payroll for a year, and the reason analysts do this is to give you a sense of how manageable would that be for the government. And you look at New York, which has the biggest ratio there. Oh wow, it's a touchscreen. I didn't expect that to go back like that. They're almost 700% of their annual total payroll, which means if they just stop paying their employees for 7 years, then they'd catch up. Is it likely that New York State's going to stop paying their employees for 7 years so that they can catch up with their retiree health benefits? Obviously not. And that gives you a sense of what an immense problem this is that they have to deal with. The reasons that these are so big, these numbers they're looking at, is because OPEB is not like pensions. Most governments have put a significant amount of money aside for their pension benefits. Even a government like Illinois or Kentucky or Rhode Island or Connecticut that have a really large unfunded liability, you're still talking about a funding ratio, the assets set aside compared to that liability of at least 50% or 60%. Governments are criticized when they're at below 80% funded for pensions. There are no state governments that have an 80% funded OPEB ratio plan. In fact, most governments are at zero. And governments are continuing, because of financial pressures, to finance it on a pay-as-you-go basis. As they get the bill for the insurance, they're paying the bill, but they're not putting any money aside. And so the fact that Worcester is doing that puts them in a very select group a very small number of governments, and yet it is so important to do that, to manage that cost, because you put that money away, you invest it, it earns some money, and that greatly reduces the amount then that the government has to contribute in future years. It doesn't eliminate it, but it does make it a lot more affordable, because the contributions that are being made to the trust pay for a portion of the benefits. And the more money that's there, the greater the portion of the cost of the benefits that's paid by the earnings of the assets, and the less annual tax dollars that need to be kicked in. So this is, these are funding ratios for those state plans. Ohio is the only one that has a significant number, and that's because they had been pre-funding it for a long time. So they're close to 60%. You have a couple more that are in the 20 to 40% range, but all those ones down there where there's no bar at all, that's because there's absolutely no money whatsoever in those state plans. That's not unusual, and if you looked at local governments, the vast majority of them, well into the high 90 percentile, would be zero. They're not putting any money aside whatsoever. And so even though the dollar amount that's owed for OPEB is not as large as what's owed for pensions, because practically no money's been put aside at all, it makes that net problem that governments are on the hook for almost as significant as the net problem that they're on the hook for pensions. And this is part of the reason you can see why. You look at what they're contributing compared with what they're actuarially required to contribute in order to fund, and by require I mean if they were going to fund, that's the target they have to hit. Only 2 of these state governments are at or above 100%. A third one's near 100%. All the other ones are less. Maybe the first couple here are setting a little bit of money aside. All the rest of them are essentially pay as you go. All they're putting aside, all they're doing is paying their bills as they come due for retiree health insurance, and they're not setting any money aside to invest to help defray those costs. What the future holds in terms of GASB's view of this is likely that OPEB reporting is going to take the path that we've just required for pensions, which is to take that liability out of the notes to the financial statements and put it on the face of the financial statements like any other liability, so that it's much more transparent and much more obvious what financial impact that commitment has on the government's balance sheet. And what's going to happen as a result of that? Well, I took out some of the big ones because they make the scale look ridiculous. But the blue line here, that's the net OPEB obligation that these state governments have accumulated because they're only doing pay-as-you-go or only funding a little bit. So they're building up this liability. If they were to actually book the liability for their unfunded liability for OPEB as it's measured now, that's the orange line. You can see in every case, that's a heck of a lot bigger than what they're reporting right now. So what is that going to do to their balance sheet? Well, it's going to kill their balance sheet. OPEB, though, since pensions is going first, pensions will kill everybody's balance sheet, and then this will only, sort of like kick the dead horse. But I think having that number right there on the face of the financial statements, and then seeing this gigantic deficit unrestricted net asset number is going to be an eye-opener for a lot of people. And I think they'll look at that, and if they hasn't gotten their attention so far, it's definitely going to drive home this point that there's an enormous obligation out there that very little money, if any, has been put aside to fund. And that's I probably went over longer than I was supposed to. I know Roberta's just looking crazy scared there that we're not going to get done. So thank you, and I'll turn the podium over.
Thank you, Dean, for that enlightening conversation on GASB and your work understanding the breadth and width of the problem as we look at it from a state perspective and also as government. Quite daunting. What I did forget to mention to you from the city's perspective, $656 million in OPEB liability. We've got about, even with dynamic work done by the retirement board, approximately $300 million of unfunded pension liability. So put that together, we're dealing with about $1 billion as city government. Obviously looking to the market to improve in order to reduce that $300 million liability on the pension side, but both of those together is going to be some hard work going forward. To continue the conversation from a dynamic panel, and I want to thank Dean for that again, we have with us today Henry Dormitzer. He's the Chief Financial Officer of Free Flow Power Corporation since February 2008. He currently serves as president and board member. He was the Commonwealth's Commissioner of Revenue till 2008, where he assisted with the governor's corporate tax reform initiative and wage enforcement objectives. He recently serves as chairman of the Special Commission to study OPEB and retiree health benefits, and retiree health care and other non-pension benefits. Prior to his current position, he served as managing director of UBS and has 14 years experience in investment banking, most recently as managing director responsible for UBS's public finance office in Boston. He's also board treasurer of Worcester Academy, a private secondary school here in Worcester, and is involved with managing the endowment and the school's physical expansion plans. Mr. Dormitzer is a graduate of Harvard College with a BA in physical sciences, but a warm welcome for Henry Dormitzer.
Thanks, Mike. All right, I'm going to get this going. Roberta, I am going to try to go fast, and if I go too fast, you can peg me with a pen, and if I go too slow, you can egg me on. You know, it's great to see a bunch of friendly faces, familiar faces. I see a number of folks who came to the OPEB Commission meetings, and thanks for being here today. You know, I was an investment banker 14, 15 years, and I know how hard it is to go out to rating agencies and get rating increases, and it is all about the management of the municipality, and what Mike and his team have been doing here has been phenomenal. Mike also was a big part of our commission because early on Mike came and spoke to us about the impact of OPEB on city budgets, and it was a very big part of the commission hearing what's happening. I want to note a couple things. I'm going to talk to you about the commission and who's on this sheet. We're going to talk a little bit about the commission. I'm going to set up what we saw as the problem in Massachusetts and the municipalities, and then I'll talk about what we did about it. But to set it up, I think this is a discussion about healthcare cost inflation and how we apportion the burden of healthcare cost inflation across our governments and our employees and taxpayers. You know, on the radio this morning, just Chuck Hagel was talking about the impact of healthcare cost inflation on military budget. It's a big issue in the country. You know, for the last year, I've actually been the CEO of our company. We're an energy development company in Boston. I got our renewal for healthcare costs for 2014, and I had a 20% increase in premium on that. And we've had that before. I'm sure many of us in this room have seen that issue. And what do you do when you're in the private sector and you have to control your healthcare costs? I'm not paying 20% more next year, but I am playing with plan fundamentals to try to control that cost, what the deductibles are, what the co-pays, all that sort of stuff. And to a great degree, that's what the commission ended up doing as well. So I'm going to start by saying, and Roberta, you got to help me on this. I'm horrified because this is leaving off one of our key members because this was, in my haste, I grabbed an old version. We put together a commission, well, the legislature put together a commission in 2011 and said, get together and figure out how to solve this problem. And on this commission, we're going to put on representatives of labor. We're going to put on minority and majority representatives of both the House and the Senate. We're going to have representatives of city government, and Dan Morgado was a phenomenal force on this commission. And you guys are going to get in a room, and you're going to figure out how to apportion the burden of healthcare costs among employees and the state and municipalities, and don't come out until you figured it out. And most people thought it was going to be a horror show. What I'm missing on here is I had another co-chair whose name was Ann Wass, and she was a member of the Mass Teachers Association. So we had a fair representation of labor, we had a good representation of the legislature, minority and majority parties, and financial managers with responsibility for the state. And the mandate of the commission was you got to have a private sector chair, someone who has no stake in the system. And I was uniquely qualified because I wasn't paying attention to the question when they asked me if I'd do it. And to cover my tracks, I said yes. We met 12 times. We thought we'd meet 6 times. We met 12 times. It was a busy commission. We procured 2 actuaries, and we filed recommendations January 11th, 2013. Those recommendations were turned into a bill filed with the legislature. There was just a hearing on that bill on Halloween last week. Let me talk a little bit about the Commission's principles. Let me just step. The Commission was a phenomenal opportunity because if you listen to this type of people that we put on this Commission, it was an advocate for every perspective going into it. So it was the opportunity for the fight of a lifetime or gridlock and not getting anything done. And instead we got a lot done, and there was no heat in the room, and it was phenomenal. And we agreed upon a set of Commission principles, which is that we cared about intergenerational equity, which is we didn't want to shift cost burdens to future taxpayers, but we had a real commitment to employees that we promised benefits to and built a lifetime worth of savings based on a promise that was made to them. So how do we deal with that? We also wanted to make sure that we can continue to attract good employees into the public service. I mean, that's how we get rating upgrades. We also wanted to recognize that there had to be an allocation of taxpayer dollars among critical services, which includes transportation, education, other healthcare services. It can't all be absorbed in this one area. And with all the talk about the ACA, healthcare reform in Massachusetts, accessibility for all, we wanted to talk about how to do this in a way that, how to do OPEB reform in a way that was consistent with general public policy, all overlaid with, in the green box in the middle, the urgent need for sustainable government because we couldn't keep going the way we were going. Everyone agreed to that. So let's talk about what the costs and liabilities of OPEB are in Massachusetts. This is a graph of Commonwealth OPEB liabilities, which since 2008 went from $9.8 billion to, in 2012, $16.7 billion. That's the unfunded accrued actuarial liability for OPEB. So big numbers. Again, they're growing, and one says, well, why are they growing? And a key part of what I think is important to remember is that a big part of why they're growing is healthcare cost inflation. That's, to me, the main stage of the problem here. There are some side stages, like demographics and how many retirees we have, or the content of the benefits that we're sending out, but it's about healthcare cost inflation. In municipalities, the overall OPEB liability is $29 to $30 billion. So municipalities have a much larger, twice the size, OPEB, unfunded accrued actuarial liability, and the reason for that is the cost of teachers is borne by municipalities, in contrast to pensions, where the cost of teachers is borne at the state level. So OPEB's affecting budgets. Let's talk about how that might creep in. Total health insurance expenditures by municipalities have increased from 2001 to 2010. They used to be 13.5% of municipal budgets in 2001. They're 20% of municipal budgets in 2010. So healthcare costs at the municipal level are starting to crowd out other items, and to the extent we start addressing our unfunded accrued actuarial liabilities, to do it even more. In fact, the portion of health insurance costs attributable to retirees in municipalities is estimated at $700 million. And if we were to fund what we call the annual retired contribution, which would start to true us up with the unfunded liability, that would be almost $2 billion of costs. So from $700 million to $2 billion if we were to start catching up at the municipal level. The same is true at the state level. Lower numbers, $415 million is what we currently spend on retirees, and we need to spend just over $1 billion, $1.3 billion or so if we were to true up to the annual retired contribution. This simple graph is what I referenced before, which is, well, what the heck's doing this? I mean, we're focusing on OPEB because of Dean. Dean did it, right? In 2008, we had to put that on our financial statements, and that was a godsend because now we focus and we see it. But we're also focusing and we're realizing we see the growth, $9.8 billion to $16.7 billion, because healthcare costs are going up so dramatically. So healthcare costs drive OPEB liability, the size of the eligible population drives OPEB liability, and the level of the benefit drives OPEB liability. So in the next couple slides, I'll show you a couple pieces on these three things, and then we're going to talk about what the recommendations were. Healthcare cost inflation, that's a big deal. The GIC, which is the Group Insurance Commission at the state level that procures health insurance, had health insurance expenditures increase 59% from 2007 to 2011. So 59% increase in healthcare expenditures from 2007 to 2011. In that same time frame, state revenue grew 15%. But that's going to be a problem. I will note the GIC is doing a pretty good job. The average national increase per person was 35%, and the average increase per person for the GIC was 26%. So the GIC is managing costs well within the boundaries, but within the context of rising healthcare costs. I also wanted to note that in 2009, the Commonwealth made a decision to go from to increase the employee contribution to their own insurance by 5 percentage points. One of the big questions on our commission was, look, there's a lot going on in the world, in the country, to control healthcare costs. And we labor unions just agreed to a whole bunch of concessions in municipal healthcare reform. So why do we have to come attack OPEB separately? Well, the answer is we have a $30 billion liability at the municipal level for OPEB. Municipal healthcare reform did help by $2 to $3 billion, so now it's 30 instead of 32 or 33. So healthcare costs are a big driver. The eligible population is a big driver. We have retiring baby boomers. The blue line here shows the percentage of the insured population that are retired, and you can see that that's an increasing line. So we have more of our healthcare premium cost going to retired people than ever before. And then lastly, I'm going to take just a quick moment. This is a pretty dense page. I'll give you a couple highlights of it. The other driver of this is the level of benefits. In the Commonwealth and most of the municipalities, you get health care benefits after working for 10 years for the state. So you vest in a lifelong right to health care benefits after working for the state or the municipalities for 10 years, and in most cases you get 80% of your premium paid for. I'm going to go to, this is the same slide that Dean showed, represented a little bit differently. What I wanted to look here is say, okay, if all those are true, we have healthcare cost inflation, we have a generous benefits program, and we have a growing population. How does Massachusetts compare to the rest of the country? Hard to see for you sitting there, but what this does is it shows you the ratio of normal cost, which is the amount we ought to be paying toward retirement benefits, as a percentage of payroll. And we are among the top 15. We pay 13, we're at 13%. So Massachusetts has one of the largest proportionate obligations in the country. So in the last couple minutes, I'm going to talk to you about what we did. The OPEB Commission filed its recommendations in January. That was rapidly turned into a bill. And we went at the level of benefits and said, hey, you had to work 10 years before to get benefits. Now to get 80% of the premium paid. Now you got to work 20 years to get 50% of the benefit paid. And by the time you've worked 30 years, you can accrue back to your 80%. That's a big change. We went from having to work 10 years to get 80% of the benefit to 30 years for that. We also said that we also raised the minimum age by 5 years from all groups. So in many groups it was at 55, and we raised that to 60 for a minimum age to receive benefits. And we focused on what's the affected population. It's one thing to enter into a public sector discussion like this and say, we're going to affect any new hires. We certainly do affect every new hire with what we're talking about, but we also said we're going to affect current active employees as well. And we did our best to try to, that creates cliff conditions all of a sudden, because previously you had to work for 10 years to vest in your benefits, so you could have theoretically a person who worked 9.5 years. We change it and they lost something they'd been planning on. So we tried to smooth out those cliff conditions to the best we could. There are a number of other things that we did. We put in recommendations relating to continuing service, that you had to retire from state service or have worked for a long enough period for the state and retire close enough to state service to get your benefit. We extended disability, I'm looking for survivor benefits. In many municipalities, there are no survivor benefits, so that a spouse who's worked and vested in benefits passes away, and the surviving spouse would lose benefits in some cases. And so in that case, we said, you know what, that we got to true that up, and that was part of the compromise. But the big deal here is that we really focused on what are we going to do with the level of benefits, who's eligible, and we're going to negotiate that out. The consequence of that is that at the Commonwealth level, there's $15 to $30 billion worth of savings over 30 years, $6 to $8 billion over over the first 10 years. I think there's a typo in that. And that there's a 30% reduction in the actual payment in year 30. And municipalities, because of bigger liability, it's $9 to $12 billion of savings. Oh, I'm sorry, it's $9 to $12 billion at the municipal level and 6 to 8 at the Commonwealth level. And it's $400 million of savings in the first 10 years for the Commonwealth and $600 million for the first 10 years for the municipalities. You know, the problem you run into is that if you defer which populations are affected, the longer you defer when the savings come in. I want to spend time on just two quick projections. One of the things that the Commission said is whatever we do, it has to be sustainable. So we have to check regularly how the liability is growing versus what the combined annual growth rate of revenue is over that time period, so that we can say, is this something that's sustainable? So this, it's hard to see. I'm going to describe it. This line, this purple line for the Commonwealth, shows a sustainable compound annual growth rate based on revenue projections. The dark blue line to the left shows the projected retiree health care benefit payments if we did nothing, way above that line, so a divergence of the two lines. The red line shows what would happen if we did nothing. We were just able to control health care costs. That's the biggest chunk. The light blue line to the right of the red is what if we couldn't control healthcare costs, but we put in place the recommendations of the Commission. And the green line is, let's control healthcare costs and put in place the recommendations of the Commission and drive towards sustainability. So again, I started by saying I think one of the biggest drivers and considerations here is that healthcare cost inflation is driving the problem, and what we're doing is apportioning the burden of that healthcare cost inflation among taxpayers and retirees. If we could control healthcare cost inflation and put in place a reasonable plan of access to these benefits, we would solve the problem. Now this next is exactly the same graph. You may not notice the difference. I'll toggle it. It looks the same for municipalities. We got to control healthcare costs, and we got to put in place a reasonable apportionment of benefits. So that is my story. I'm happy to answer questions when we sit down. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Great job on the Commission, again, bringing some diverse forces together and working in a collaborative way, nonpartisan way, to get the real numbers out there and some real solutions out there for what will be controlling these OPEB costs. I think Capitol Hill and Washington could take a lesson from what you've been able to do in making this issue real and something people can get their arms around, as well as putting some real solutions forward for addressing this in the long term. Just for some perspective, the state reforms, if adopted, and there's some local options on that as well, if those were adopted in their entirety, the city would save about $100 million off our $656 million liability. So there's still a core liability there that would not be addressed by just the reforms at the state level. Another piece, I think, a tidbit of information is right now we're spending a little over $80 million annually on healthcare costs for our employees and retirees. Our budget's north of $500 million. And but for the reforms that we've instituted in healthcare costs over the course of my tenure from 2004 forward, working collaboratively with our employees, our unions, our retirees, and the council, we would have been today well over $110 million annually. So you can see, if not for reform, more and more of our budget dollars would have been gobbled up, and we would not be providing the base services that our taxpayers and citizens expect. Our next speaker is a personal friend, somebody I hold in the highest of regard. He's part of my support group as we deal with some of the stresses and strains of local government management. Dan Margotto is a town manager of the town of Shrewsbury, appointed in September of 1997. He's previously served as the town of Grafton's first town administrator for a period of 10 years. Prior positions include the town administrator of the towns of Easton and Blackstone, and a brief stint as administrative assistant to Shrewsbury town manager and executive secretary to the Board of Selectmen in his hometown of Swansea. His initial experience in the field of public administration was as a college student when he was elected to the planning board of the town of Swansea at the age of 21. Dan's a graduate of Bridgewater State College and holds an MPA from Clark University. He has, for 20 years, served as an instructor at the Clark University Master's Public Administration program, specializing in the areas of policy analysis and local government management. He has served over the years in various capacities on a number of committees and statewide task forces, all associated with local government through his association with the Mass Municipal Association. He was most recently a member of the Special Commission to Study Retiree Health Care and Other Non-Pension Benefits, the committee on OPEB that Henry chaired. And he's past chairman of the Joint Labor Management Committee, JLMC, for Municipal Police and Fire. It's my pleasure to introduce Dan McGraw. I want a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. The city manager is going to try to further balance his budget by taking my pen. I want my pen back. Thank you very much. Unbelievable. See, it's pennies that get you there. I want to thank you for coming out this morning to listen and to discuss a very important subject that we really need to see some meaningful reform occur immediately. I want to commend Henry Dormitzer, who, along with Ann Wass, was able to take a very diverse commission and do excellent work. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've served on several statewide commissions and task forces over the years. And in many instances, these task forces are sort of put together as part of a legislative fix at the last moment. They might meet a couple of times, file a report that's soon forgotten. This was a very unusual group. We came together, we had tons of spectators, and we even tried meeting in smaller rooms to see if that helped the situation, but it didn't. We just packed in more people. He said we met like 9 times. Actually, we met many more times than that because we had subcommittees and different types of discussion groups. But it was just an outstanding commission because everyone came to the table from a very, very diverse backgrounds, very diverse interests, but we all centered on one thing, and Henry was so excellent in focusing us on it, was that something has to be done, and something has to be done substantively, because as you heard from the earlier speakers, this is a growing problem that, if not addressed, will crowd out all other types of municipal spending. The chart that was left up on the screen here is a very important chart, and if you read the full report, which is on our website, you'll see that the chart's a little different between the state and the munis. The issue of sustainability, the purple line that you see heading off into the future, is the line that was identified as saying that, look, because we believe in sustainable government as one of the guiding principles, or the overriding guiding principle of the Commission, what we're saying is growth of spending in this area can't go over that line, because beyond that line, it means that in order to achieve that spending level, we've got to cut into other spending. The recommendations that are contained in the report and the recommendations that are part of House Bill 59 achieve that line of sustainability, providing all other aspects of our projections work, primarily the healthcare cost containment legislation. So if the intended reductions in costs intended through the healthcare cost containment legislation and the other aspects of the legislative environment that we're now working, or the regulatory environment we're now working in, aren't met, then even the recommendations contained in House Bill 59 still do not get us to a road to sustainability, which is why a very important aspect of House Bill 59 that was contained in the report of the Commission is this checkup that has to occur on a periodic basis to make sure that the intentions of the reforms are actually being realized. And if they're not realized, then the executive director of the Group Insurance Commission will be required to make some public disclosure in that regard. And that's really a very important aspect of both the report and the ensuing legislation. The reforms that are proposed are very, very difficult on affected populations. We originally were looking at this from the perspective of, okay, let's say if we make this reform effective for new employees, where would that get us? And we had excellent work done for the commission by the various actuaries. And we found that affecting only new hires doesn't give us really any savings in the foreseeable future. In my mind, 10 years, 10 to 15 years from now is where this is going to hit substantially across the board, virtually every municipality here in the Commonwealth. Some are going to have more difficulty than others. We then sort of looked at, well, let's model employees that have already been hired but maybe haven't been vested. And we continually to model different implementation strategies because, as Mr. Dormitzer mentioned, we're trying to strike this balance between sustainability and what were the assurances that were made to employees, that many of whom, particularly those that might have left other professions to come to work for municipalities, particularly those in the financial areas. How are we going to deal with that employee relationship? And we found that we had to continue to work towards affecting employees that have been working for the various cities and towns of the Commonwealth, which is why we ended up with the phase-in requirements which were contained within House Bill 59 and the report. The line of sustainability for the munis is different than for the state. Okay, our level of sustainability, munis, is 3.25%. For the Commonwealth, it's 4%. And the reason for that is our revenue stream is dramatically different than for the Commonwealth, because we rely so heavily on the property tax. This is actually a bigger issue for the cities and towns of the Commonwealth than the Commonwealth itself, because A, the number that the Commonwealth has to deal with is smaller, and B, the Commonwealth has a revenue stream that is far different than the cities and towns. For instance, at the hearing last week on House Bill 59, several of the state reps and senators that spoke, basically for the most part, their theme was, what's the rush? And we've got this tobacco money. And this tobacco money apparently is one of those things that's sort of like when you were a child and you had $5 in your pocket, you really thought about spending it like 4 times over. Okay? You're going to buy this, that, and the other thing. When you add it all up, it wasn't $5 anymore, it was like 20. And I got the sense that the tobacco money may be doing that, but I'm not a state finance expert. So sustainability for the cities and towns is very, very important because the other spending we have to do, particularly in the areas of education, public safety, and public infrastructure. So House Bill 59, its hearing was on Halloween, believe it or not. We all trucked into Boston on Halloween. The Gardner Auditorium was packed, and I was able to speak along with Mass Taxpayers and Jeff Beckwith of MMA, and several of the other unions. Leadership was able to speak. And everyone, that sort of has really thought about this really came from it from the perspective that something has to be done. Unfortunately, the rank and file is a little, their focus is obviously a little different than the focus of the financial folks and maybe the administration and people like myself and the city manager. The rank and file is looking at this as, hey, how does it affect me? How does it affect my family? How does it affect my co-workers? And I fully understand and appreciate that. Thus, that's the real issue that we have surrounding House Bill 59 and reform in this area, because we don't want to hurt people that have worked for us, that have provided outstanding services, and people that we've, in many instances, recruited into our organization by saying, well, look, the pay's this, but the benefit is this, and now we've got to sort of change our story, and I can fully appreciate that. On the other hand, something has to be done. And every month, we filed our report last January. We're coming up on a year on the filing of the report. We still have no legislation. And every year that goes by, the number's getting bigger. The number of employees that are going to be more affected adversely that really don't know what's going to happen to them. The uncertainty out there is extraordinary. So the problem worsens. So what I would say as a result of this discussion today, and I'm talking to another group tomorrow, is delay is not in our interests. And we really need to ask people like yourself, because the state reps and the senators aren't hearing a whole lot from people that are saying, you know, something's got to be done. What they're hearing from are people that are saying, hey, slow this thing down, we have time. Okay? I take the opposite position. I think the time has passed. You know, if we would have done something, let's say 10 years ago, hindsight's wonderful. 10 years ago, the fix that would have to have been made at that time would be far less drastic than the fix we're talking about today. And certainly if we delay another 3, 4, and 5 years, that's even going to be more draconian and more difficult. Because we can only see, when we look around the country, those problems that haven't been fixed or even addressed suddenly will rear up. And we mentioned Central Falls, Rhode Island as an example of that. So coming from this discussion today, what I'd hope you would do is study the information and make some contact with your state representative, your state senator, and saying, look, something has to be done. The report, I feel, balanced reform with taking a very thoughtful and a correct approach to the affected populations, and should be adopted immediately, with some minor modifications that have been suggested by the Massachusetts Municipal Association. Thank you.
Great job, Dan, and Jeannie of the Research Bureau has given me the indication our next speaker is going to be compressed into 2.5 minutes in order to keep this forum on time. Roberta has got the bullwhip in the front row. So our final presenter is Stephen Eade. He's a former research associate at the Worcester Regional Research Bureau and now a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He edits publicsectorinc.org, a project of the Manhattan Institute. He's also a contributor to the site. His work focuses on public administration, public finance, political theory, and urban policy. His writings have been published in the Worcester Telegram Gazette, the Orange County Register, the New York Post, Interpretation, a Journal of Political Philosophy, and City Journal. Steve was previously a senior research associate, as I mentioned, at the Research Bureau. He holds a bachelor's degree from St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and a PhD in political philosophy from Boston College. How about a warm welcome for Mr. Eade?
Okay, well, I know everyone's excited to get back to work, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. Okay, so just to talk about, I'm going to talk about OPEB from a national perspective, somewhat similar to the approach that Dean took, and hopefully not be too redundant, but the first thing I want to talk about is just the size of the debt. How much do state and local governments owe for retiree health care OPEB compared to their other major debt commitments? There's not great data about OPEB nationally compared to what we have on pensions, but the figure that most people settle on is about $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. That's how much they owe that they don't have assets on hand to pay for. Just to put that in context, pension liabilities, when they're estimating using more conventional actuarial methods, or come in a similar size, around $1 trillion. Estimated using more conservative accounting actuarial assumptions come in at about $3 trillion. This is one of the most controversial issues in public finance in recent years, how one goes about valuing pension liabilities. I know Dean has quite a bit to say on this issue. I'm not trying to get into this controversy. I'm just saying that if you value pensions and OPEB using the same assumptions, accounting actuarial assumptions, pensions are a bigger problem. I mean, pensions are a very big problem. All the stories in the newspapers, all the attention that we've seen on pensions over the recent years it's been very right. It's been appropriate to focus on pensions as much as we have. OPEB is a big problem too. Pensions are a bigger problem. The last bar is just for credit market debt, how much they owe to municipal bond investors. And note that if you put pensions and OPEB together, that actually comes into that state and local governments actually owe more for retirement benefits than they do for debt that they have issued for capital purposes. Useful to point out. The fundamental problem with OPEB, it's been touched on a bit already, I think, as I would just say, just to begin very basically, is this effect of crowd out. that pension and healthcare costs for state and local governments continue to rise at a rate above which revenues are growing. So over the past 10 years, just to get the facts right, pensions and healthcare costs for state and local governments have risen at an annual median growth rate about 8 to 10%. Revenue growth has been below 5%. Then that happens every year. That compounds. There's this crowd-out effect on budgets, this squeeze effect on budgets, and what happens is you just have less money available for services. Less money for services. That means, and that is manifested in fewer jobs, fewer workers. State and local government jobs are still down very far below what they were pre-recession. This is where they peaked. The first bar is where they peaked. The second bar is when the recession ended in the summer of 2009, over 4 years ago, and it's been straight downhill since then. Since the recession ended, state and local jobs still way, way down, and they only recently started gaining back jobs at the very beginning of this year and still haven't gained back that many. In the private sector, if I had that mapped on this chart, you would see a line going straight up beginning in early 2010. The private sector, as we know, has been adding jobs every month since 2010, not state and local governments, and a big reason for that is this continuing pressure from healthcare and pension benefits. Another way to think about crowd out and the impact on services is actually in terms of salaries for employees. I mean, because escalating pension and healthcare costs are very bad for employees too in some ways. Over the last 10 years, the median local government salary has been flat on an inflation-adjusted basis. Anybody involved in labor negotiations know that there have been a lot of zeros in recent years. And a big cause of that is just, again, these pensions. State and local governments always have their compensation weighted more towards benefit than salaries than in the private sector. In recent years, that's become more and more true. And again, that's not just benefits for active employees, that's benefit costs are going up for people who are currently retired now. And that means less money for salaries. Also in the context, I was mentioning the case of OPEB, there are governments now who are actually paying more for retirees' health insurance than they are for active employees' health insurance. I know Buffalo, New York, that's the case, and also Detroit. There are more things to say about why OPEB is a problem, in addition to the magnitude and the crowded issue. First of all, you have this big issue of intergenerational inequity under the current pay-as-you-go system, which most governments are forced to fund and manage OPEB. Just to get straight what this means, current taxpayers are paying the benefits of people who are now retired. So if retirement benefits are a form of deferred compensation, you're compensating people for services they performed to the public decades ago. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's the situation that governments now find themselves in. The costs are, compared to pensions, healthcare costs are just way, way more uncertain. You keep in mind, when you're promising to pay somebody a pension, $30,000, $40,000 pension, you kind of know how much that's going to cost you over the course of their lifetime. You can estimate that. Healthcare costs, you're promising to pay someone a service, not write a check. It's a service you're promising to pay. And you can make estimates about what the cost of that service will be in 20 years, but you can't be really certain about that. Also, federal healthcare policy changes could have an enormous impact on OPEB and the cost of OPEB. I'll talk a little bit more Obamacare in a minute, but one thing that's talked about a lot as the federal government lurches its way towards getting its own finances in order is raising the Medicare age of eligibility from the current 65 to 67, which is where Social Security now is, and a lot of people think eventually that's where Medicare will be headed. That means more fiscal discipline for the federal budget, but for state and local governments, that means 2 more years of very expensive coverage, and you'll see a big increase in unfunded liabilities. So talk about enough about the problem. The solutions. Other panelists have talked a lot about pre-funding, the need to get to pre-funding. There's no other responsible way to manage retirement benefits than to put aside some money in the current year so that you can invest and pay for benefits that you know you're going to have to pay for down the road. That way you can pay for it using investment return. Remember, state and local governments plan to pay for around 60% of their pension benefits using pension reform. I mean, it's a huge relief. That's not happening with OPEB because it's just paid directly out of tax of taxpayer revenues. This chart here, I think, is a great chart, which I ripped off from a report issued last year by the State Budget Crisis Task Force, shows why pre-funding is so critical and why they're not doing it right now. This is the Texas retirement system. It has the blue line and the red line. The gap between the blue and the red line is about $1 billion. That's how much Texas would have to contribute in addition to what it's already paying in order to start socking money away to pre-fund those future costs. So that's why it's not doing it. But notice that at a certain point, about 10 years in the future, it will become cheaper, much cheaper, in fact, to be pre-funding its OPEB benefits. And then also notice that the red line, which represents a fully funded, the pre-funded line, is much smoother. The costs will rise much more gradually. They're not escalating like they are in the blue line. So it's just obviously fiscal suicide to not be pre-funding your benefits from a public finance perspective. And ultimately, I think the ratings agencies are going to continue to ratchet up the pressure on governments to do more about this. So if the pressure is not going to come from some other place, certainly they still have a lot of influence. Pre-funding is not a panacea, however. There are cases of governments, there are not that many, who have actually pre-funded their OPEB obligations. The one that I've studied especially carefully is Los Angeles. Los Angeles, strangely enough, has been pre-funding its OPEB obligations since the 80s. And in recent years, there have been instances in which Los Angeles's OPEB liability has actually been better funded than its pension liability. So it has plenty of money on hand to fund benefits in the future. It's been doing the right thing. All the credit in the world to Los Angeles. However, I think Los Angeles is a case in which it's kind of the exception that proves the rule, that its experience is not terrifically encouraging in some ways, because first of all, the benefit is very generous. It's the last time I looked at it, around this time last year, at its peak, there's some retirees earning a benefit valued at around $14,000. It's possible that doing such a great job in funding the benefits has enabled benefits to be more generous than they otherwise would be. And also, it's the total bill is over $350 million, and this is in a city which is definitely going through crowded. Los Angeles is down 5,000 workers since before the recession, and they have this huge OPEB bill. So you're still dealing with a very similar problem here. And you essentially have two pension problems. I mean, the problems that we associate now with managing pension funds, how when there's a recession, the stock market tanks, you have to backfill the pension fund exactly at the time when you don't have as much revenues coming in, so your budget is squeezed at the worst time possible. So that's what happens with OPEB. So keep that in mind when we're talking about the many benefits of pre-funding, as substantial as they are. This argument that OPEB is necessary to attract and retain workers, I'm not so sure about. I mean, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that this is becoming increasingly rare in the private sector. I mean, the first bar graph shows that if you look at this information is 2009 information from the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. The first graph, that is. So 2/3 of state and local workers are eligible for OPEB. Less than 20% of private sector workers are eligible for it. In the second graph, if you look at just only really large employers offer retiree health care, either in the private or public sector, similarly with pensions. But if you just look at large employers who offer OPEB, about 80% of state and local governments are offering it, and 20% of all total employers. And that number would be much smaller if you're looking at smaller employers. So this is something that's similar to defined benefit pensions. With a defined benefit pension, public workers are already getting a benefit that's more generous than what most people in the private sector get. And then you add OPEB on top of that. I think it's a real question, in light of the very severe management challenges associated with dealing with this benefit, that it really is as necessary as is sometimes said. Just talk briefly about Obamacare and OPEB. You can't talk about the federal government is just obviously increasingly involved in healthcare policy, and any aspect of healthcare policy is going to be in some way influenced by the effects of Obamacare. One thing to note is the Cadillac tax that's coming online in 2018, in which plans that are judged to be too expensive essentially will be hit with a 40% excise tax on any cost above a certain benchmark. That's going to increase liability somewhat for state and local governments. Then there is this issue of the exchanges and the opportunity, the subsidized Obamacare mandated exchanges that have been referred to by some people as a stealth bailout of state and local governments. And the idea is, now that the federal government is committed to making available to everyone, in principle, access to health care, and also relatively generous subsidies to enable people to buy health care. Potentially this enables state and local governments with a way out of their retiree health care commitments. Two governments, particularly Detroit and Chicago, have already announced plans that they are in fact going to eliminate OPEB and instead tell their retirees to go out and purchase healthcare on the exchanges. If you're a retired couple earning below 62%, you will qualify for a subsidy. And then that's from the federal government. Then in the case of Detroit, they're going to give people like $120 a month also as a stipend. So they're going to cap their liability and to use that to go out on the exchanges just like anyone else would. So I think this very realistically could be a game changer, although there's a lot of debate in circles about how irresponsible this is. Is it going to hugely increase the liability for federal taxpayers? I definitely think this is something state and local governments should be considering. I mean, if you're trying to do the best for your taxpayers, if that's your bottom line, I think that there could be enormous benefits to taxpayers looking towards Obamacare as a way to get out of retiree health care. And just to wrap up, two final points. There's the title of the talk of the forum today made reference to bankruptcy. OPEB alone is not going to drive a city into bankruptcy. The costs are just not that massive, but it seems to be the case if you look at the bankruptcies, bankrupt cities and the condition they're in. I mean, if you're managing your pension system, your taxes, you're probably managing your OPEB system very, very poorly as well. And without exception, it's a partial cause of all these bankruptcies in Detroit, Central Falls, the ones in California, and all of them are cutting OPEB, okay? Most of these bankruptcies are not cutting pensions. None of the California cities are cutting pension benefits. Central Falls to Detroit is trying to, but pensions are much more, just legally very, very sticky to cut. The conventional wisdom is that OPEB is less legally protected than pensions, and certainly in bankruptcy when the city government has a lot of power in terms of what it can cut. Those are all getting cut. So again, thinking about what's in retirees' interest, employees' interest, if state and local governments don't do a better job managing their OPEB commitments, they will be cut in bankruptcy almost certainly. We've talked about solutions. Pre-funding is an attractive option. In the research reporters report, they also talk about something called a retiree Medicare trust, which is a sort of defined contribution arrangement for OPEB, which I think is an idea that has merit. But I would say that, I mean, the optimal solution, I would say, is just to phase out the benefit. I think that's the most radical solution. I would say it's also the most reasonable solution. I don't think there's a compelling reason for taxpayers to continue to offer this benefit. There are enormous managerial problems. There are real questions in my mind about whether or not state and local governments will ever get to, most state and local governments will ever get to a really good pre-funding arrangement. And so, I mean, there are enormous legal issues, there are enormous political issues with that solution. My focus here is just on the policy, and I would say on policy grounds, that's what I would recommend as the optimal, most, kind of ideal world solution. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Again, just some perspective for the city of Worcester. We've got approximately $5 million in our trust against what is some $20 million annually we should be depositing in order to meet this reality of some $656 million worth of other post-employment benefits liabilities. Statute calls out that we're only required to pay 50% of the retirees' health care benefits. We pay 75%. And I think it's important to note that for all the speakers and those in the audience, I think there's great respect for the work that's been done by our retirees through time. And our goal is to preserve these benefits as we look at the realities of the struggle to actually be able to pay them. So the conversation has to obviously continue. It will continue because this will be rebroadcast on Channel 3, am I correct? Right, and Roberta's asked me that I time the release of Prozac in the public water supply, so we keep everybody upbeat as we deal with this issue, right? We want to stay positive. As Dan said, there are real solutions, but we have to take command now. In the interest of time, I'll just ask one question to our panel, and I'll ask it to Dan. Dan was the municipal representative on the OPEB commission, and he was the sole vote no on the ultimate adoption of that plan. So, Dan, what was your concerns with the Commission's proposal?
On an overall basis, I fully support the work of the Commission and House Bill 59. The reason for the no vote by myself really goes back to the slide that Mr. Dormitzer put up relative to the guiding principles that guided the work of the Commission. One of them was intergenerational equity. We found, as a result of the city manager's presentation during the commission information gathering stage, that there are communities out there that are actually upside down, where they have more retirees than active employees. A recommendation in the commission's report, and now repeated in House Bill 59, is a freeze of any further contribution shifts for existing retirees. Now, in the case of Shrewsbury's case, we have some retirees that are 50-50, some are 75-25, but a few years ago, some of our retirees were at 90%, 10% as a result of that whole equal dollar situation that we all got involved in back before the law was changed. What I had suggested is that if we're going to talk about intergenerational equity, we need to understand that if you cannot thoughtfully, and I stress that, thoughtfully and considerately alter the contribution ratios of retirees, that whenever the retiree contribution rate is when they retire, that's what they have for life. If you have to continually adjust benefits in order to meet your sustainable government obligations, that's going to mean putting more pressure on existing employees, because you have this cadre of retirees, ever-growing cadre of retirees, that are fixed at a set rate. Now, Labor's concern is that management has been very aggressive in altering the benefit structure for retirees, and I can fully understand that and accept that. So what I had suggested during the deliberation is maybe we could work something out where we would think about retirees that have been long-term employees, you know, they put like 30 years of service in, and have a pension below a certain number, that they would be held harmless. But newer retirees, particularly retirees like myself, for instance, that have a higher salary, higher pension, you know, maybe a guy like Magato can afford to go from 75-25 to 70-30 or something in the future. So that's why there was also a piece about surviving spouses. There are some communities that still don't offer surviving spouse coverage, and the recommendation of the Commission's report and in a subsequent legislation mandates that. And MMA has this thing about unfunded mandates. So the no vote wasn't that I felt that the Commission was wrong or that the reform is wrong. It really focused on that piece because there are some communities that may need to adjust contribution ratios in the future, and they shouldn't be barred from doing that. And that's the reason why I voted no. And I suspect that when the MMA files its proposed amendments to House 59, that's one of the items that we'll discuss. But again, the work of the Commission was just outstanding, and our chairman deserves huge credit for that.
Thank you, Dan. A follow-up question to Henry Dormant, sir, who was chairman of the OPEB Commission. Henry, are you and Dan talking since his dissenting vote? Or?
No.
No. So there was some tension on the board.
You know, it's ironic in a way that people focus on Dan's no vote because Dan was one of the most powerful positive presences on the panel, and I think Dan did what he had to do. I think that in the life cycle of public debate about a sensitive issue, you got to get your issues on the table, and the no vote was a perfectly good way of getting that issue on the table. I think that Labor has some very strong views that make sense on the survivor issue. I think the unfunded mandate question is a strong one. They tried to mitigate, the Commission tried to mitigate the unfunded mandate by saying there has to have been enough savings from the rest of the reform to have funded the survivor benefit. But you know, what always happens in the life cycle of public policy like this is you get the absolute best recommendation you can on the table that the most people agree with, and then it gets to the legislature. And that's where it really happens. Ultimately, we're just a commission. We're not lawmakers, and our legislative process is legislative. And so, absolutely, we're speaking, and it was a very good commission.
Thank you, Henry. We'll now open it up to questions from the audience.
First of all, congratulations. That was a very excellent presentation, very informative on a very complex issue. I was just curious as to whether or not anybody's done an analysis of what would be the impact of a single-payer universal health national policy on this whole problem.
That's above my pay grade. Henry?
I'm going to wing this one. The answer is, yeah, people do analyze that, we constrained the work of the commission to something we thought the legislature, could do. But what I take from your question is, if we had a way to control healthcare costs, and isn't single-payer healthcare, that is I think the implication, we really wouldn't be talking about OPEB. I mean, it would be a fixed liability. What we're seeing is it's growing because of some demographic trends, but largely because of healthcare costs. And so I think your question is a well-placed one.
Can I?
Please, Dean.
Hold it down.
There we go. One thing I wanted to add to that, though, is that, governments have a way of shooting themselves in the foot when it comes to OPEB. To a certain extent to pensions as well, in that, they go through cycles of good times and bad times, and when times are good, they shoot themselves in one foot by improving the benefits, and when times are bad, they shoot themselves in the other foot by not contributing money to the trust, and as a result, the liability gets even worse. And I think, even with a control of healthcare costs, even with a single-payer system, it's still there's still the issue of what benefits the governments are awarding, and and if they're going to continue to be, for lack of a better word, profligate, or at least not cognizant of the costs of the promises that they make to their employees, it almost doesn't matter who's paying for it. They're still going to make it massively expensive, because there's no control or no effective control on the individual decisions that they're making.
Thank you, Dean. Dan and I have learned we're good like that, and both of us wear Kevlar bulletproof shoes, so we're able to continue to walk. So we appreciate the shooting in the feet. Next question.
Thank you, Mike. Another shout out to the commission. I had the good fortune, and it was very interesting to witness all of the OPEB commission meetings and that hearing down at the State House, and you guys have done just a wonderful job in addressing this issue. I have a related question to Mo's, and I'm wondering, maybe this is a question nationally for Mr. Reed, if he's seen anything out there, but historically we've seen in the healthcare industry that there's shifting of costs. We've all understood this uncompensated care pool, so people who can't pay at all, somehow that money gets charged to somebody else from the medical community. And one of Dan's favorite articles is a Time magazine article that shows, well, how crazy it is how hospitals put down, what the costs are for different things and who actually has to pay those costs. So I guess my question is there been any discussion or anybody looking at retirees as a separate, unique population that deserves some kind of focus by the hospitals, the medical community, to say, hey, for that group of people who have earned these benefits and are now under a lot of stress for the municipalities, that they get some kind of a discount or deal directly from the hospitals?
Well, Dean actually in his talk already touched on this issue of the implicit rate subsidy that retirees already get just by being pooled together with the active employees. And that is, even if a government doesn't actually pay any of the premium costs to a retiree, but just allows retirees after they leave service to be grouped together with the younger employees, they get a better deal than they would, certainly in the pre-Obamacare days, although that situation changes now with the subsidies that are available to them now. So, they get a better deal just by being grouped as part of the with the active employees now than they otherwise would. Anybody else want to add anything about that?
With the quality of the healthcare system in certainly Central Mass and in the states, our seniors are living longer, so we have them longer as a subscriber that we have to pay for. They're also high utilizers, both in pharmacy as well as in healthcare. They're drivers from kidney transplants and some of the failings that take place as a result of age. And so there's a great subsidy paid by the active employees as we pool these groups together in order to seek the best rates for all. And it's something that we manage very closely as we look at because we're self-insured, as we look at where those costs are and where those costs are being driven. And as we shift from active employees to more retirees, than active employees is going to be a greater and greater concern of how those costs are controlled well outside, I say above our pay grade, well outside of municipal government as we look at healthcare costs nationally and regionally and here in Worcester as to how we're going to contain those costs, because ultimately that's going to end up as part of the OPEB liability being paid by the taxpayers.
Mike, can I make a quick comment on this?
Sure.
I mean, one of the fascinating issues of retiree health benefits is that when you're over 65, you qualify for Medicare. So our over 65 retirees, their annual cost of health care is just under $5,000. That's what the state or the municipalities pay. For those retirees who are under 65, it's almost $11,000. So it goes. The subsidy argument is a true one, although I think the ACA mitigates it to some degree because now we have pools for everybody. But the cost of those over 65 is greatly subsidized by Medicare, which goes to the question that was asked before, which just two observations. If we raise the qualifying age of Medicare, it's going to have a dramatic impact on Shrewsbury, on Worcester, on Massachusetts, on municipalities. And the move of the commission to drive the age higher of retirement and closer to Medicare is also going to have a real constraining impact on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry. Last question.
Thank you. This is probably best directed to Dr. Mead, and I apologize in advance if it's too oversimplistic or maybe even silly. But in your presentation, it led me to question the standards relative to the health insurance liability, and actually if they're in place yet. I was curious if the standards are in place, or if they're still in development, or if they're when we can expect them to be ready. Again, I apologize if it's a silly question, but there was one slide in particular that led me to believe that there were some future impacts that they were looking at.
Well, the standards that require governments to measure their OPEB liability and disclose them came out in 2004, and governments have been doing that now for about 5 or 6 years. Most governments, it was phased in based on size. In June of last year, we issued new standards related to pensions. And one of the most significant changes in those new standards was to take that liability from the notes and to put it on the face of the financial statements right next to all the other long-term liabilities that governments have, which obviously has a massive impact on their bottom line because you're adding a very large liability in a lot of cases, and there are no assets to balance it. It's not like purchasing a capital asset with debt. You have the debt, but you have the capital asset, and you have more or less no impact. Those standards will go into effect for governments in about a year, and the board right now is looking at OPEB in light of what they did with pensions, and if you look at their tentative decisions so far, it looks like more or less they're going down the same path, and next year we'll propose new standards that would essentially do what we just did with pensions, which is to make changes to how it's measured and then to move it from the notes onto the face of the financial statement. So if you go by our normal schedule, that probably means a final pronouncement a year from then. So you're talking about the middle of 2015 with a few years of implementation. So we're still quite a few years off. But those numbers that are there right now are pretty good numbers, and they're in the notes to the financial statements. And so they might not be as transparent as they would be right on the face of the statements, but they're there already, and so you have those numbers to look at and get a sense of the magnitude of the problem that you're looking at.
Thank you, Dean. That concludes our forum. I want to thank the Research Bureau, Roberta and Jeannie, and the board for putting this important discussion together. It's going to be important for those that are here in the audience and those that will be tuning in on the rebroadcast on Channel 3 that they get involved. As Dan said, the town manager from Shrewsbury, this issue is going to affect us all, and it's not specific to just city government. It's going to affect taxpayers and citizens and quality of life, so it's important to get involved. I want to thank Henry Dormitzer, Stephen Ide, Dean Mead, and Dan Morgado, our distinguished panel. How about a round of applause? And also thank our sponsors, Commerce Bank, Hanover Insurance Group, and Polar Beverages for making sure that these types of discussions continue to take place here in our community and throughout the Commonwealth. Thank you.